Polish-Soviet Friendship Society. The journal was published in Poland for the Poles in Polish, and was also one of the outlets through which the Soviet Union projected its own image in this East European country. In a country, I should mention, where people in the post-war decade had a lot of reasons to dislike the Soviet Union and all things Soviet. So the two men exchanged pleasantries. They agreed that the firing of the previous editor was a good thing. They discussed a new section entitled Polish Affairs in the Soviet Union. And after that, Jung, the editor, said that he'd welcome more Soviet visual materials for the journal, because as it was, he had to patch up this entire illustrated space with materials from the French press, from the British press, and other Western sources. Jung said that he was especially interested in more pictures of attractive Soviet women for the covers of the journal, because he said that the circulation of the journal was dropping. It was only 68,000 at this point. And this is how Lukovnikov described the message. Okay, this is how he described what transpired. According to them, that is to say the Poles, those issues are the most successful which featured a photograph of a woman. I remarked that the success of the journal can hardly depend on its cover. Jung agreed that the content of the journal also plays an important role, but the facts show, he said, that no matter what content, the issues with a girly cover return from the newspaper kiosk in the smallest quantities. According to Jung, such is the nature of the Polish reader. And then he went on, he actually pulled out a graph to illustrate his point. And Lukovnikov continued that the graph showed that those issues of the journal were most successful, which showed the décolleté Soviet artist Tatiana Pileckaia, the ballerina Galina Ulanova, and the number of Polish and foreign women. Jung said that the editorial office ran out of photographs of pretty Soviet women. He expressed the wish that the Soviet Information Bureau provide such visual material to the journal. The copies of the journal are actually very hard to find for some reason, even the pictures of the copies of the journal. But here's one from the 1980s, which suggests that the taste of the Polish reader prevailed all the way into the late socialism. Now, there are three things about this exchange that I think are worth pausing over. First of all, Jung's frankness, yes, a certain amount of daring that he displayed. What he was saying, basically, was that on the cover of the journal, the Polish reader wanted to see cleavage, not collective farms. Second of all, I found interesting Lukovnikov's receptiveness. Yes, even though he was skeptical of this request. He relayed this request up to Moscow, to his bosses, and without the kind of scathing commentary that would have maybe accompanied the report even a couple years before. As a result of which, the exchange resembled a dialogue, and that's very important. This may be unsurprising in some ways. After all, it was November 1957. Stalin was no longer in power for a few years. In theory, fear no longer paralyzed cultural cooperation within the socialist bloc. In fact, under Khrushchev and Gomulka, the respective leaders of the two countries, Poland gained a certain amount of autonomy in managing its own internal affairs. That included the all-important sphere of culture. At the same time, the Soviet-Polish cultural relations not only assumed a legal basis, but they also came to be grounded in a good deal of reciprocity, and that's very important. What may come as a surprise, however, and certainly did to me, and this is what I'm trying to emphasize in my book, is that the potential for such a dialogue existed all along, all throughout the post-war era, as did the will and the ability on both sides, Soviet and Polish, to forge these mutually satisfying cultural relations. Why is that important? Well, I think there are several dimensions to that. First of all, I should mention I started to think about the Soviet-Polish cultural relations as a problem of empire. I was less interested in empire as an oppressive institution, a repressive institution. There was plenty of cases of that, of course, as everyone knows. I was more intrigued by empire as a kind of a political structure, social, political, cultural structure that needs to sustain itself in some kind of a viable way. Because a considerable body of literature suggests that the most successful empires in the world have been those in which the interests of the center have somehow been aligned with the center of the peripheries. And of course, in the Soviet East European case, culture was a very important part of the equation. Culture writ large, not only as literature and the arts, of course that was very important, but more broadly, culture as social values. Culture as a sphere of circulation of meaning of all kind. And culture, finally, as material opportunities. Yes, and here I think about the entire institutional framework that was geared to producing literature, arts, propaganda, and so forth. Another way of thinking about this problem is that the Soviets had more wherewithal to project effective soft power than has been acknowledged, and in fact, perhaps than we'd expect. Yes, and here I'm drawing on Joseph Nye's definition of soft power. It's the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payments. And attract is what the Soviets tried through various institutions such as Vox, the All-Union Society for Cultural Relations Abroad, the Soviet Information Bureau, not to be confused with the Communist Information Bureau, through embassies throughout Eastern Europe, scientific institutes, and so forth. And attraction is what they ultimately failed to do. Not, again, I should stress, because of lack of will or good ideas on the Soviet side, but because the Stalinist system itself, I'm showing, discouraged initiative, discouraged reaching out, especially to foreigners, of course, during Stalinist times, but even afterwards. The system allocated enough resources to get certain projects, cultural outreach going, but then it seemed to have been never enough for these projects to succeed. As a result of this, the Poles were frustrated. They felt shortchanged by the cultural contacts with the Soviet Union. Not only the elites and the population, but even certain Stalinists who are known as Stalin's Polish puppets, they often refused to follow the Soviet models as well, which I found surprising. People like Jakub Berman in Poland. The Soviet officials and observers also felt frustrated because here was this pressure from the Moscow for them to project certain ideas about the Soviet Union, which the Poles didn't accept. They felt that the Polish officials, journalists, cultural figures, scientists led them by their noses all the time. In consequence of which, this very complex relationship developed between various actors in the Soviet Empire along the Soviet-Polish axis that I could talk about for a long time. Instead, I settled for a picture that some of you might know about. I think of it as a late Soviet response to Tom and Jerry. This is, of course, the cartoon series Nu Pagadi, about the evil wolf trying to catch a little rabbit. What's interesting about this, and the reason I chose it also, is that the relationship, despite our expectations, is not black and white, not portrayed in black and white terms. So, for instance, the wolf has a certain degree of charm. He's dancing tango on the right with a rabbit. The rabbit is not as innocent as we might expect. As well, he's often very provocative and mischievous. And so it was with the Soviet-Polish relationships, at least in the sphere of culture. There are a couple other reasons why findings about these subtle nuances of Soviet-Polish relationship were important. For one thing, we know of so many agents of the Soviet Empire who actually were relentless Sovietizers. Yes, I think it's quite revealing to show that not everyone was that way, because it helps us refocus from certain explanations about the failure of the Soviet Empire to mobilize these vast groups of people in the near abroad, from thinking about maybe the human potential to rather structural possibilities of the Soviet system. Second of all, there's a tradition of thinking about the Russian-Polish relationship as a relationship that's inevitably antagonistic. And no less of a figure than Czesław Miłosz, the Polish writer, remarked in the 60s that the history of Polish-Russian relations can largely be reduced to the collision of the two different concepts of freedom, concepts of freedom, concepts maintained by writers and closely bound up with the pedagogic functions, different though these functions were in the two countries. So my findings suggest that on the practical level, many Polish and Soviet writers, indeed artists, had more in common with each other across the border than each of the groups had with the respective cultural bureaucracies that put them in their place in the first place. Very quickly, a quick chronology, which I didn't mark up, but this is a rough chronology of the story I'm telling. 1943-45 forms the background, a time when the Poles actually worked out their story, their formula for cultural contacts with the Soviet Union, which focused on the national idiosyncrasies that were so all important to win over the publics in Poland, and which then the Soviets, many Soviets didn't respect later on. 1945-48 was a transition period, sometimes known as the People's Democracy for Poland, a period of hopes in the Soviet Union for cultural liberalization. In terms of Soviet-Polish relationship in culture, we see some interventionism on part of the Soviets, but also a good deal of flexibility on their part in trying to understand the need for doing propaganda differently, gearing it towards the specific needs of the recipient publics. There was also a good deal of confusion in all this, yes. The Soviets had different signs coming from different signals from the party bureaucracy, different from the state, but all in all, there was very little cultural cooperation at this time still. 1949 to 53, the period of Sovietization, which was characterized by very little flexibility, at least on the surface, on the Soviet side. Cultural cooperation developed, but it was very dominated, very unilateral. Soviet-based focus on transforming the East European cultures on the Soviet model. And then we get to the period of our interest, 1953 to 57, which again was somewhat of a reversion to the years 45, 48 minus Stalin, yes? So we see some interventionism, some flexibility, a good deal of confusion, although we see much more cultural cooperation than in these initial years. What we also see, and that's what I'll focus on, are the standards for projecting effective soft power into Eastern Europe also are going up for the Soviets. Yes, I'll talk more about this in a moment. So what we see in 53, 57 is that the developments in the Soviet Union and Poland offer unprecedented opportunities for an open dialogue. The Soviet participation in this dialogue is only partially a response to the new circumstances. Partially it stemmed from the potential that existed there in the first place. And so in that sense, it constitutes a continuation also of the attempts to establish it earlier. So the cultural figures, the agents of and the officials, the agents of the Soviet soft power, as we can call them, tried to recast the cultural project against the background of a couple of developments. The first of these developments was the change in Soviet policies, which was now being framed by the growing hands-off approach to Eastern Europe. It was also characterized by a focus on much more urgent issues. in the Eastern Bloc, such as the social instability, for instance, in East Germany. But was also informed by a degree of liberalization at home. The second element of this background was the Polish Thaw, which was initially a response to the developments in the Soviet Union, and then very quickly it outpaced these developments. Yes, and Poland became somehow, the Thaw in Poland gained a life of its own, as it were. I think that nothing reflects better this unique historical juncture than the poem, a very long one. This is an excerpt by Polish poet Adam Warzyk. It's called Poem for Adults. It's quite well known, and it was published in the summer of 1955. In the poem, Warzyk described the working class building the New Foundry, this huge industrial complex outside of Krakow. Described the working class as primitive, as inhuman, basically as a mob that was not so much building socially as howling with boredom, indulging in drunkenness and being dissolute. So basically as anti-heroes of the official propaganda and of the official standards for socialist morality. So again, the poem wouldn't have appeared without the death of Stalin, but then nothing comparable appeared in the Soviet Union itself during these years. So the question is, how did the agents of the Soviet soft power responded to these developments? And these diplomats, officials, cultural figures, and so forth. The most obvious group were the Hardliners. These are the ones we know most about. Yes, and the most picturesque example among them was the Polish ambassador to Poland until March 1954. He didn't last long. Georgi Popov, he was a man who was very known for his explosive character, for his penchant for intrigue and rude demeanor. In that sense, he was an exception to the rule. At some point, he told the Polish president, Bolesław Bierut, that for the kind of job he was doing, he would nominate him even for the post of the district committee in Moscow, upon which Bolesław Bierut complained to Nikita Khrushchev, who called an urgent meeting of the presidium, after which Popov was relieved of his post and made a factory manager somewhere in Russia. In the meantime, Lazar Kaganovich, another member of the presidium, during this meeting observed that the arrogant ambassador conducted himself like the governor general. Yes, so specter of empire coming back. That's one example. There were, of course, more flexible, more ingenious Soviet officials. They were also marginalized in some ways. As with the change of Soviet policy, their institutions shut down or they were sidelined, they lost support. The editor of Freedom, Wolność, Polish newspaper, Soviet newspaper, for the Polish population, said an interesting thing on June 16, 1953, so not too long after Stalin's death. He said that the journalist mustn't create the impression among the readers that the Soviet people gives everything to the Poles and that almost builds socialism for them. And he said this in a private meeting with his subordinate editors. That's not the kind of line that would have been acceptable on the surface a couple years before. This particular editor is an example of a thoughtful approach to soft power on the Soviet side. He was somebody who was deeply committed to providing informative, interesting, and politically correct articles for the Polish reader that didn't have to resort to images of photogenic Soviet women in this work. But the newspaper was shut down in December of 1954, just as the psychological climate for establishing this kind of open dialogue was setting on. The same is true of another institution that was charged with this task, the Soviet Information Bureau. It was later transformed into the news agency RIA Novosti, but before that it lasted for a little while without much support. And there were plenty of people in this organization who also realized we can do our job differently. We've been doing it for so long. Now that we actually can say what we think, we are losing the support. They're taking out our budget and cutting the editorial staffs and so forth. So there was a kind of a personal drama for these people. There was another group of Soviet officials, cultural figures, and the participants in the Soviet project who stayed on. And they were also frustrated for a number of reasons. First of all, because of fellows like Adam Vážek, who tested their patience, as did some other poets, especially journalists in Poland, who at some point actually teamed up with some reform-minded, younger officials in the Polish Communist Party, and became staunch advocates for a change of discourse, a change of tone in the public sphere. Second of all, Stalin was dead, but a lot of officials in Moscow, to the great chagrin of people who were in East European outposts, were still afraid to take the kinds of risks that were involved in reaching out to foreigners on their own terms. Third of all, the Soviets continued having trouble producing high quantities, high quality propaganda. Yes, and that was important, not only because they had to appeal to these East European publics on their own terms, and these were the publics whose standards were relatively higher, simply because the Sovietization was much shorter in these countries. So not only because of that, but also because of the increased cultural activity and outreach from the West, which raised the standards for the Soviets. So in 1954, for instance, Poland saw the growth of cultural links with Eastern Europe, with the world. Czechs, fellow Czechs, and also the French, Western media outlets, cultural outlets were providing very attractive fare of cultural products that were nicely wrapped, nice covers. They had descriptions, bibliographies, catalogs, and so forth, something that the Soviets could rarely offer. 1954 in Poland, for instance, saw also tours from the best performance from France, from Germany, India, and China. So the world was opening up, as it would be in the Soviet Union. But in the meantime, there was a kind of a chasm between goals and practice as far as the Soviet soft power in Poland. I should also say that the growth of socialist culture in Poland raised, ironically, standards for the Soviets as well. The ambassador Nikolai Mikhailov wrote to Moscow in January of 1955, and he pointed out that a folk and dance ensemble from Poland called Mazowsze in many ways matches the best analogs in the Soviet Union. That was also something that would have been heresy a couple years before. And then he said something outrageous, which was that in the artistic affairs we must not only teach the Polish comrades but also sometimes learn from them as well. Such an open admission that Eastern Europe had something to offer to the Soviet Union at this point would have been, again, unthinkable shortly before. But again, I should emphasize that this was not just an opportunistic change of rhetoric as a response to the turn in Soviet policies, but rather a continuation of these signals that have existed before. Lastly, I'd like to mention another cause of frustration to the Soviets, and in some ways to the Polish communists who would come to power shortly. The growth of the Soviet East European mass contacts through a couple of channels. First of all, student exchanges. Second of all, mass tourism. What it did is eliminated the distance between the Soviet Union and the socialist countries, and in many ways exposed the hyperbolic claims of each country's propaganda about the other bloc countries, notably along the most important axis in the empire, the Soviet East European axis. As a result of these developments, the communist parties and all kinds of hard power institutions lost even more control of what the visiting foreigners were doing. For instance, hundreds of Polish and Hungarian students it would explain the momentous events of October of 1956 to their Polish peers, often fraternizing along the lines that certainly the Communist Party didn't welcome. Or, for instance, the Soviet tourists who took a trip to Poland at the end of October and landed in the turmoil of the 8th plenum of the Central Committee when Władysław Gomułka was elected the first secretary of the party, and which was accompanied by mass demonstrations in favor of Gomułka all over Poland. And these Soviet tourists received live editorials from passers-by about how the Soviet Union had intervened in Polish affairs for so long, and how they're not welcome. But surprisingly, there were also some fraternizing on this front, as a number of Soviet tourists expressed sympathy for the changes taking place in Poland at the time when the Soviet newspapers didn't cover these events very much. These are perhaps the most starkest examples during very important political upheavals, but the trend continued in the decades that follow. So to sum up quickly, the story I'm telling is about the structural problems of the Soviet Empire, resulting in the Soviet inability to mobilize the elites and masses in the newly created sphere of influence. It's a story about the hopes and frustrations of the Soviet officials and cultural figures, also on the human level. People who wanted to do much and knew how to do the better job in propaganda, but who were unable to do so for other reasons. The final chapter on which I focus today, covering years 1953 to 57, I see it as a story of a learning curve on part of the Soviet officials, cultural figures, and also a story of new possibilities after Stalin, new possibilities to maintain an empire through non-coercive means. But it's also a story about the Soviet soft power as a moving target. It's because while the Thaw, de-Stalinization, and the changes that followed the death of Stalin in many ways facilitated international contacts and cultural cooperation, then socialist internationalism, this umbrella term for all kinds of mass cultural initiatives that connected the socialist countries in the post-Stalin period, that brought these different countries together, in fact, continue to undermine Soviet efforts to project their image into the near abroad. So, thanks. That's all.
Thank you very much, Patryk. And we'll open the floor for questions in a minute, but I have an initial question to ask, and that really is, how crucial is 1956 to this story? Is there a recognition in 1956 that soft power simply isn't working, and that they've had to resort back to coercive force to keep Eastern Europe in line? Is there a realization in terms of how they're dealing with soft power in Poland? Is it is there a recognition that it's failed, or is there some sort of effort to kind of continue it or reintroduce it?
That's a very good question. The year 1956 is a major caesura in that sense that it introduces the actual, well, first of all, there's this realization that soft power as it was, it didn't work out too well for the Soviets in the preceding decade. And as a result of this, also as a result of political changes that spurred different kind of relationship and cultural relations, there are a number of agreements, international agreements signed between Soviet Union and East European countries that concretize and legalize and spell out exactly what it is that we're doing. And these agreements are guided by the principle of reciprocity, which is very important to put this kind of thing on paper, something that didn't exist before. One of the interesting and very intriguing things and fascinating things that I found is that a lot of this cultural cooperation that was taking place in the long post-war decade, it was on a very ad hoc basis. That is to say, the Soviets oftentimes they didn't know what they were supposed to do. They knew quite well often they knew quite well what would work, but in fact they were left guessing what to do based on the kind of cultural policies that were put in place at home, as did the Polish communists, who implemented a set of parallel cultural policies that eventually Sovietized the country, not fully, but did. So it was a major year. Yes.
Open the floor for questions. Have microphones. Please. Mm-hmm. We're getting a microphone to you. Hold on 1 second.
While we're here at the Kennan Institute, we all try to benefit from this very place and from the collections which are available. So my question is how you benefited from the collections at the Kennan Institute. Like, could you find some microfilms, copies of journals from the period, any library collections which were very useful, particularly for your research? Thank you.
Thank you. I benefited a lot from the sources at the Kennan, from the proximity to the Library of Congress and from the kindness of our librarians who actually tracked down a set of microfilm documents in a remote part of the country and a library that was actually willing to lend some microfilm. So I benefited from that greatly, as I did from the help of my research assistant who actually scanned all these piles of documents for me, which enabled me to work with them. So the quick answer is we can talk about the actual sources perhaps afterwards if you're interested, but there are certainly a lot of sources here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mikhail Minakov. I have a question to you. How you differentiate the soft and hard power, especially in the Stalinist period? The core period that you describe in your and analyze in your book. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question, and the answer, of course, is not something that you know, that these two things were very much related. Soft power, as followed by, as I'm following now, I understand it basically as culture non-coercive. Means I'm focusing on the cultural exchanges. I suppose making Soviet Union attractive economically would also be part of soft power, but so I'm narrowing down my field of inquiry. Hard power, there was plenty of it, of course, and we know about this. There were the security forces, the military, the counterintelligence, the intelligence, the police, the militia, all these things were hard power. But of course the question is how they're related, and the answer is that very much, and differently so than in liberal democratic regimes.
Just to add, what about science and educational
Yes,
systems?
as well. That's inclusive, yes.
I just imagine the sorry if I may.
Mm-hmm.
I just imagine the Stalinist period with very harsh party control in politics, in educational sphere, in science, in everything basically, and it's really hard for me to differentiate where's the borderline between soft and hard in that period. Because later, yes, in Khrushchev era, in Brezhnev era, we see the dividing line, but in Stalinist period, do you feel that borderline is there?
No, this is an excellent question. It is very intimately bound together. Yes, I should say that one of the problems that I started facing is that, yes, of course, we have those two extremes. We have the science and the arts, but of course, all these people were subject to all kinds of supervision. One thing that I haven't been able to answer fully is on the one hand, we have all this apparatus that's geared towards towards convincing people. And this is really, these people are really trying to convince, the other side that life with us is so much better. And so this was the general principle. But on the other hand, it doesn't work, yes. So that's what I've been trying to.
To follow up on,
Alexander Okun, and
Oh,
I have
okay.
also a question.
okay, good.
In continuation of the previous question, I think that one of the most effective tool of soft power is to incorporate into the society the especially educated people who will be promoting, who promote some ideas and so on. So very successfully in politics, in secret service in Poland, yes. So a lot of politicians, Polish communists, secret service officials came to Poland after the war from Soviet Union, and were there any examples of cultural intervention? So directors, writers, journalists with Soviet background in Poland. So maybe these people were the tool of the soft power, of Soviet soft power.
Yes, as mentioned, there was a range of people, and I think there could have been done more to expand this particular inquiry. I should also say that part of the elimination process was the kinds of sources I was able to get in Russia itself, which are rather hard to find, yes, but I was able to glimpse into certain kinds of exchanges in the archives of the international